If you bought a Samsung Galaxy S22 in Europe, the UK, Australia, or most of Asia, you did not get the phone that was reviewed. The reviews you read, the camera comparisons you watched, the benchmarks that convinced you, those were almost certainly the American version. With a different chip, a different camera processor, measurably different performance. Same name on the box. Samsung never mentioned the difference. Two people buy the exact same Samsung Galaxy on the exact same day. Same model name, same price, same box. One is in the United States, one is in Germany. Most people would assume they have the same phone. They don't. And Samsung never told either of them. The phone in your country is not the phone in their country. If you bought a Samsung Galaxy S22, S21, S20, S10, or Galaxy S21 FE in Europe, the UK, Australia, or most of Asia, you received a different processor than the person who bought the identical model in the United States. Not a different color. Not a different storage option. A fundamentally different chip with a different architecture, a different image processing engine, and measurably different performance under real-world conditions. Samsung called their chip the Exynos. The American version ran Qualcomm's Snapdragon. Both phones went on sale the same day. Both phones had identical names on the box. Neither box disclosed which processor was inside. What Exynos and Snapdragon actually are. Samsung is one of the few companies in the world that both designs phones and designs the chips that go inside them. Their semiconductor division, Samsung LSI, produces the Exynos chip family. It is designed in-house, manufactured in Samsung's own fabs, and sold internally to Samsung Mobile as a guaranteed customer. Qualcomm is a separate American company. They design Snapdragon chips and have them manufactured externally, historically at TSMC, the same foundry Apple uses. Samsung has to pay Qualcomm licensing fees and royalties for every Snapdragon chip it uses, for every unit sold. That cost difference is significant at the scale of tens of millions of phones. The gap between the two chips shows most clearly not in the processor cores, which are often architecturally similar, but in two specific areas: the GPU, which handles graphics and gaming performance, and the image signal processor, or ISP, which is the component that determines how your camera processes every photograph you take. Most people assume the camera quality of a smartphone is determined by the lens and sensor. The sensor captures light. The lens focuses it. Both matter enormously. But what happens to that captured light before you see an image on your screen is determined by the ISP. It processes the raw data from the sensor. It runs the computational photography algorithms, HDR merging, noise reduction, color science, low light processing. It determines how fast your shutter fires and how quickly the image is processed. The physical camera hardware can be identical. The lens, the sensor, the aperture. None of it matters as much as the ISP when it comes to low light performance, color accuracy, processing speed, and computational photography. Two phones with the same camera hardware and different ISPs produce different photos. Qualcomm's Spectra ISP, used in Snapdragon variants, and Samsung's own ISP and Exynos chips are designed by different teams with different algorithms and different color processing philosophies. This is what worse camera actually means in the Exynos versus Snapdragon conversation, and why the difference is real even when the lens specification on the box is identical. Why Samsung does this. The actual business logic. The brief answer is that Samsung runs two separate businesses simultaneously that have conflicting interests. Samsung Mobile sells phones. Samsung LSI sells chips. If Samsung Mobile buys all its chips from Qualcomm, Samsung LSI loses its largest guaranteed internal customer. Using Exynos in a portion of its phones keeps the chip division profitable and justifies the billions Samsung spends on chip design and fabrication infrastructure. This is called vertical integration, and it is a legitimate business strategy. The same logic that drives Apple to design its own chips and why Apple's phones perform as consistently as they do. The difference? Apple uses the same chip in every iPhone regardless of region. Samsung did not. The cost difference is also significant. Every Snapdragon chip Samsung buys from Qualcomm comes with a royalty fee attached. Qualcomm charges device manufacturers licensing fees based on the selling price of the device, not just the cost of the chip. For a flagship phone selling at $1,200, those royalties are meaningful at tens of millions of units sold. Using Exynos, which Samsung designs and manufactures in-house, eliminates that per-unit payment entirely. At the scale Samsung operates, the financial difference across a generation of flagship phones runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. The US specifically receives Snapdragon, and has for most generations, for a reason that has nothing to do with generosity toward American consumers. US carriers have historically required Qualcomm chipsets for their certification and compatibility processes. The relationship between Samsung and American carrier networks, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, made Snapdragon the practical requirement for the US market. Europe, the UK, Australia, and most of Asia were left with Exynos by default, not because the Exynos was equivalent, because those markets were where Samsung's own chip business needed the volume and where carrier certification pressures did not force the issue. The performance gap, what testing actually found. When the Galaxy S22 launched in February 2022, reviewers who obtained both variants ran direct comparisons. Tom's Guide tested both the Exynos 2200 and Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 versions of the Galaxy S22 plus head-to-head. In 3D, mark Wildlife Unlimited, a sustained GPU benchmark that reflects real-world gaming conditions. The Exynos 2200 lagged behind the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 by 18 frames per second. In the more demanding Extreme variant, the gap narrowed to 5 frames per second, but remained measurable. Android Authority testing confirmed the GPU performance advantage sat consistently with the Snapdragon variant. GSM Arena documented the same disparity across camera processing speed under sustained load. The camera gap was more nuanced. DxOMark tested both Galaxy S22 Ultra variants and assigned them identical overall scores. The detail within that score, the Snapdragon version scored marginally higher on photos. The Exynos version scored marginally higher on zoom and video. Neither result was clear-cut superiority, but in low-light photography, the condition most people care about most, the condition where ISP quality matters most, the Snapdragon variant consistently produced cleaner results in independent testing across multiple publications. The GOS scandal. When Samsung got caught throttling both versions, the Exynos versus Snapdragon gap was real and documented. But in February 2022, a completely separate Samsung scandal emerged, one that affected both chip variants equally, and was in some ways worse than the processor difference. In February 2022, as Galaxy S22 reviews were landing, developers and benchmark testers noticed something wrong. The phones were scoring dramatically better in benchmark apps than they performed in actual games and applications. The benchmark scores reflected the hardware's full capability. Everything else was being held back. What they found was GOS, Samsung's game optimizing service. Running silently and by default, GOS monitored which app was active and throttled CPU and GPU performance for over 10,000 applications, including not just games, but YouTube, LinkedIn, Microsoft Office, and Zoom. Geekbench subsequently removed the Galaxy S22, S21, S20, and S10 series from its benchmark browser, stating that Samsung's software behavior made their scores unreliable indicators of real-world performance. CPU performance under GOS dropped by as much as 46% in independent testing, bringing a 2022 flagship down to the performance level of a Galaxy S10 from 3 years earlier. This is important. GOS throttled both the Exynos and the Snapdragon variants. The brief implication that Snapdragon users were unaffected is wrong. Both processors were throttled. The problem was not Exynos versus Snapdragon. The problem was Samsung shipping a phone whose marketed performance figures were not accessible during normal use on either chip. Samsung settled the resulting class action lawsuit in South Korea for approximately $58 million. The settlement established a legal precedent, describing a chip's performance in marketing while running software that prevents users from accessing that performance is consumer fraud, regardless of which chip is inside. How Samsung handled the disclosure problem. Samsung's marketing materials for every generation of the dual-chip era showed one specification sheet, one set of camera specs, one processor listed, one benchmark result in the promotional materials. The processor listed varied by region in the fine print of Samsung's own spec pages on their website. Accessible if you knew to look for it, navigated to the right regional variant, and understood what the technical names meant. No box disclosed the chip variant at point of sale. No advertisement mentioned the regional difference. Most buyers in Exynos regions discovered the difference through third-party tech reviews, Reddit threads, and XDA developers' forums, not through Samsung. Samsung never proactively communicated to customers in Exynos regions that their phone contained a different chip than the version receiving the most positive press coverage. XDA developers' comparative analysis threads across multiple Galaxy generations gathered hundreds of thousands of views precisely because users in affected regions had no official source of information to turn to. The community had to build its own database of which countries got which chip, generation by generation, because Samsung's official communications didn't provide it clearly. Petitions calling on Samsung to either sell Snapdragon globally or price Exynos variants lower gathered significant numbers of signatures across multiple generations. The S20 Exynos petition on change.org gathered more than 30,000 signatures, confirmed by multiple outlets covering the campaign in April 2020. Samsung's official response across multiple generations: silence on the disclosure question, or statements that both chips provided the best possible mobile experience for customers in each region. They were not lying exactly. They were not telling the truth either. The anger that formed in XDA forums and tech communities across Europe, the UK, and Australia was not primarily about performance. Performance gaps can be tolerated. The anger was about learning, after purchase, through YouTube videos and forum threads, that the phone you had been sold was not the phone getting the reviews you had read. What changed and what didn't? In 2023, Samsung launched the Galaxy S23 series with Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 globally. For the first time since 2015, every Galaxy S23 sold worldwide ran the same chip. South Korea, Germany, Australia, the US. Same processor. The community response was unambiguous. This was what should have been happening all along. The S23 represented Samsung acknowledging, in product form, that the dual-chip approach had become a liability for its reputation, for its relationship with the enthusiast community that influenced mainstream purchasing decisions, and increasingly for its legal exposure following the GOS settlement. Then, Samsung partially reversed course. The Galaxy S24 and S24 Plus used Exynos 2400 chips in select markets, while the S24 Ultra ran Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 everywhere. The pattern had not ended. It had shifted from affecting all models to affecting the mid-tier of the flagship lineup. The Galaxy S25 series in 2025 returned to global Snapdragon across all models. Samsung's semiconductor division is simultaneously developing the Exynos 2600 for the Galaxy S26 with an AMD RDNA 4-based GPU. Early benchmark data suggests significant performance improvements over the Exynos 2200 that generated the most controversy. Whether the S26 splits regionally again, with Exynos returning to select markets, is a question Samsung had not officially answered at the time this script was written. The business pressures that created the dual-chip era have not disappeared. Samsung LSI still needs customers. Samsung Mobile is still the most reliable one. Mid-range and budget Galaxy devices, where margins are tighter and public scrutiny significantly lower, continue to ship with Exynos variants in markets where Snapdragon was never guaranteed. The scrutiny that forced the S23 global Snapdragon decision applies at the flagship level. Below it, the practice continues quietly. It's not just Samsung. The regional hardware disparity is not Samsung's invention. Apple has restricted features by country. Satellite emergency connectivity rolled out in stages by market, with some regions still waiting years after US availability. Apple Intelligence, the AI feature system that Apple announced as its flagship software advancement in 2024, launched in the United States and took months to become available in Europe, with some countries still restricted well into 2025 due to regulatory requirements. OnePlus has sold phones under identical model names with different RAM configurations in different regions. Motorola has shipped the same model numbers with different processors in different markets. The global launch of a flagship smartphone rarely means identical product globally. It means announced simultaneously, shipped with regional variations that the announcement materials don't discuss. The specific consumer rights question this raises has not been resolved in most markets. Selling a phone with a performance-inferior processor variant under an identical model name at the same price, without box-level disclosure of the difference, is not illegal in most jurisdictions. The EU's consumer protection framework requires that material product differences be disclosed before purchase, but the definition of material has not been tested specifically against the Exynos situation in court. It has been subject to consumer advocacy campaigns, petition drives, and regulatory attention in South Korea. It resulted in a $158 million settlement when the GOS throttling scandal gave plaintiffs concrete evidence of specific performance misrepresentation. The underlying practice, same name, different chip, no label, has never been definitively ruled illegal. And it has never fully stopped. How to check before you buy. If you are buying a Samsung phone in 2026, the current Galaxy S25 line runs Snapdragon globally. For any older model or mid-range device, the check takes less than a minute. GSM Arena's specification pages list processor variants by region. Search the model number and look for the chipset field, which shows all regional configurations clearly. Kimoville and Nano Review provide the same information with regional breakdowns. The model number itself is the most reliable indicator. Samsung uses a letter suffix in the model number to identify regional variants. SM-S908B indicates an Exynos variant. SM-S908U indicates a US Snapdragon variant. The letter is not printed prominently on the front of the box. It is not explained on the box at all, but it is there if you look for it, on the label on the back of the box next to the barcode in small print. That is where Samsung disclosed the difference, on a barcode label. In a suffix, most consumers have never been told how to interpret. Two people bought the same Samsung Galaxy. Same name, same price, same day. One of them got a phone with a faster GPU, a different image processor, and a chip that required no licensing payment to a third-party company. The other got a different chip, a different camera experience, and no information about any of it. The only difference between the person who knew and the person who didn't was whether they found a Reddit thread before they bought. Samsung never put the difference on the box. They still haven't. Every Galaxy from the original through the latest generation, how each one changed the industry and what Samsung got wrong along the way, is on screen right now.